Hi, I'm Max Kaiser. Welcome back to the Kaiser Report. Time now to go to upstate New York and speak with James Howard Kunstler of Kunstler.com. James is an author, blogger, and an urban architect. James, welcome to the Kaiser Report.
Nice to be here, Max.
All right, James Kunstler, a crony capitalist mortgage settlement deal has been reached to bail out the banks via the back door yet again. Your thoughts?
It is just amazing how they not only never run out of tricks, but how the American people never seem to tire of being snookered. Among other things, they've snookered the New York State Attorney General into leading a task force for, in his State of the Union message, President Obama announced he was forming a task force to look into mortgage fraud, and he appointed the New York State Attorney General, Eric Schneiderman. And the fact is, we have a Department of Justice and a United States Attorney General who he may be leaking sawdust as he walks down the halls of justice. We're not really sure he's a real human being because he hasn't done anything in 3 years. But the fact is, they have a criminal division, and they have done nothing to investigate mortgage fraud or any of the associated shenanigans for the entire Obama term. So, you know, this is just really a new set of smokescreens to perpetuate what is coming to be just a tremendous control fraud.
But what is it in the American character that makes them feel good about getting screwed?
My own theory is that American life is just so frantic, you know, with people struggling very hard to make a living and being distracted by every kind of, you know, electronic message and show and program and entertainment conceivable, that they're just, you know, the cognitive dissonance, the collective noise in our brains is so immense that we can't really reflect on anything that's happening to us. However, going back to some previous conversations we had where I scolded you for making revolutionary remarks, I'm beginning to wonder whether we're going to get what I would call a John Brown moment. And John Brown, for those of you who might have a fragmentary memory of American history, was that fellow who in the late 1850s mounted an insurrection at Harper's Ferry and really changed the tone and tenor of the national debate about what we were going to do about that big problem of the time, which was, were we going to continue to be slaveholders or not? And he galvanized the attention of the nation. And about 2 years later, we were in the Civil War, the greatest convulsion that the United States ever went through. And so I'm wondering now, you know, when will the John Brown moment come for financial misbehavior? That, you know, is not only unseemly, unethical, criminal, and bad, but is really hurting this nation terribly.
The revolution in Tunisia started with one fruit seller. The French Revolution started with one girl talking, you know, price of bread going up. And talking about John Brown, one individual starting the revolution back in the U.S. in that time. You know, you talk about the financial crimes, you know, to contrast, let's say, in Asia, in Middle East, North Africa, the more information they got, the more upset they became. You know, the satellite photos in Tunisia of how the top 1% was living got everyone upset. In the U.S., however, the more information they get, the more docile they become. You know, Julian Assange or WikiLeaks giving information makes people want to just lie down and cuddle up into a fetal position and hope it all goes away. Isn't there, again, is it drugs in the water? Is it obesity? Is it too much football? Is it de-evolution? Are Americans now, I know a lot of Republicans don't believe in evolution, but do they believe in de-evolution? Because it appears as though the mindset of the average American is devolving.
There are a number of things going on that revolve around the question of authority and legitimacy, and especially of the news media. And, you know, I personally consider myself allergic to conspiracy theories, and I don't think that there is a media conspiracy to keep the American people ignorant. But they're certainly doing a terrible job of reporting. You wonder why the so-called thought leaders in places like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times have they haven't reacted at all to the shenanigans going on with the New York State Attorney General and the task force for mortgage fraud and the smoke screen at the Department of Justice. They're just not paying attention. So, we're seeing some kind of an epochal failure of people in charge. It's like, control fraud itself, which is using accounting by people who run things, namely people who run banks and the people who regulate them, and the whole idea that you are a legitimate vested authority and people expect you to be discharging your duties and doing things properly, but yet you're not doing it. So there's kind of an equivalent to that in the news media. So we're getting kind of a control fraud of news too. But, it seems to me to be more a matter of incompetence than malice in the case of the news media.
Okay, you don't buy into the conspiracy theories that are out there. However, according to a recent survey, people who watch Fox News are less informed than people who watch no news. So clearly, the Fox people know that if you have a population that is being dumbed down by purposefully inflating the debate with lies, deception, and fraud, that's a population that you can steer by the nose in any direction you want them to go. Okay, now Chris Hedges believes that part of the reason for the National Defense Authorization Act is that the banks are going to collapse and that bankers don't trust the police to maintain order. So they want to give the military some boosted powers in the United States because they see this thing collapsing and they want protection from the mob. Your thoughts?
Chris is a very intelligent guy and very experienced as a war correspondent. And, I think that he's a voice that we ought to pay attention to. I would imagine the problem a little differently. I think that there's just kind of a general level of nervousness throughout the whole culture. That it's not just the bankers, but it's really everybody in any kind of authority is so nervous about the failures that they've brought about that they really no longer trust the system to keep on running, and they're taking extraordinary measures. In regard to your previous statement about Fox News, when I was a young newspaper reporter, I investigated religious cults and political cults, and one of the things that impressed me tremendously was how a group of people could simply subscribe to a bundle of ideas or shall we say programming, and then their whole mental program was then set and they didn't really have to review any of their beliefs. And I think that that's happened to a tremendous extent now in our culture.
Right. So you've got Bill O'Reilly is more like Charles Manson than Edward R. Murrow. Now, let's talk about something you're very keen to write about and talk about over the years, peak resources. And I want to ask you, is there any connection between the curtailment of civil liberties in the U.S. and this peak resource, the peak oil, peak water, et cetera?
Well, there's certainly a connection between all of these enormous looming issues. The failure of capital finance, the failure of civil order and the faith that we can run a civil society, and the availability of the vital resources that we need to have an economy that continues to grow and produce the ability to do things like service debt. So yes, these things are all intimately connected, and they all end up redounding into the question of whether or not this is a society that has enough confidence that it will be able to keep going and carrying this project of civilization into the future. Right now, we're not too sure about that.
All right, James Kumsler, here's another curious thing. There's a Washington Post showed that with a Democrat in office, the anti-war movement, made up mostly of Democrats, has declined drastically. They are apparently fine with the wars while they team up, while their team is in, so to speak. What's that all about?
It probably, again, a question of authority. If you identify yourself as a Democrat or a progressive and your party is carrying out the wars and doing it in a way that, there's no draft, So people aren't being dragged off to, against their will. They're volunteering. And in fact, it's really kind of a job center for that disappearing cohort of young men, especially, who need to work with their hands and can't go to work in a factory or do some kind of, or any longer, build houses or do other construction jobs. So, they work with their hands killing people in other lands. So, probably it's regarded as a kind of a jobs program.
Right. Well, and of course, when they go to these wars, they often lose their hands. And then Goldman Sachs creates hand commoditized and collateralized futures contracts that they trade with other banks, and they profit in another way on the death and misery of poor U.S. servicemen sent to do Goldman Sachs' dirty work. Okay, there's another war, the ongoing financial war. And once again, strangely, the Democratic voters don't mind financial crimes because their guy, Obama's in office. So somehow, like when I listen to Bill Maher on HBO, no matter what financial crime is committed, he reparrots the same stupidity that comes out of the White House about how the bailouts are profitable, how the auto companies are doing fantastically well. And so these liberals, so-called, just because they have their guy in office, they don't seem to understand what a financial crime is. Well, is it just financial illiteracy on that Huffington Post side of the aisle?
I don't think so. And I think it's certainly all parts of the political spectrum. Thomas Frank wrote a book a few years ago called What's the Matter with Kansas? And the basic point of his book was, why do voters get snookered by political parties into voting against their own interests? But the situation's changed now a few years later. And what we're seeing is something a lot worse than that. What we're seeing is now a comprehensive failure of leadership, and not just in politics, which is the most visible kind of leadership, but comprehensively through American life, and to some extent Western life. A failure of leadership in politics, business, in the media, in the clergy, in education, at every level. And that makes for a very nervous society.
All right, James Howard Kunstler, we're out of time. Thanks so much for being on the Kaiser Report.
Quite welcome, Max. Always a pleasure.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Kaiser Report with me, Max Kaiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank my guest, James Howard Kunstler. You can find Howard Kunstler at kunstler.com. If you'd like to send me an email, please do so at kaiserreport@rttv.ru, or you can follow me on Twitter. Until next time, Max Kaiser saying bye, y'all.